Hi, I'm Bruce Nock. Thanks for taking the time to watch this introduction to what we had to say about hoof care, modern hoof care. Hoof care that's based on biomedical science, principles of structural design, and objective observations. I call it hoof care for the 21st century. For those of you who aren't familiar with Liberated Horsemanship, we're a professional teaching corporation. We have 26 faculty members and field instructors in 12 states and 7 countries. People from more than 20 countries have participated in our hoof care training programs. And in 2023, we did workshops at the AZA Mid-Year Conference and at the AAZK Annual Conference. We teach a whole animal approach to hoof care that is entirely compatible with the efforts of modern zoos to provide their animals with a natural environment that enriches their lives and encourages them toward natural movement and behavior. Our hope is that this video gives you an idea about the quality and depth of our hoof care training program. First, I'm going to give you an overview of our thoughts about hoof care and its importance to the health and longevity of animals. Then Cindy Hall will describe how the multifaceted approach we advocate greatly improved hooves at Naples Zoo, where she's the animal operations manager. You know, people have been trying to maintain and improve the health and integrity of the hooves of horses for hundreds of years. A lot was learned over all those years. Most of it was about how to prepare and apply shoes. Information that, well, frankly, isn't in any way relevant to the hoof stock in zoos. Many horse people now recognize that horseshoes were originally designed to counteract and continue to be used to cover up the poor hoof quality that results from suboptimal living conditions. It isn't an image zoos should be conveying to visitors. But information that is relevant to the hoof stock in zoos has exploded over the last couple of decades with the emergence of natural hoof care. And the fundamental principles and concepts that have emerged will produce strong, healthy, barefoot hooves in zoos as well as in stables. So what is natural hoof care? Bona fide natural hoof care, not some superficial imitation. Well, let's start with the obvious. The most conspicuous element of natural hoof care is the so-called natural trim. The problem is there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about what a natural trim actually is and how to do it. There's been a lack of training by qualified instructors. There are misconceptions about fundamental concepts, and there's a lack of understanding about certain hoof features and how they function, even among scientists. The goal of an authentic natural trim is straightforward. It's to encourage the hoof to grow toward the form that develops naturally in places where the animal was designed to live, doing what it was designed to do. Under those aboriginal conditions, wear and growth balance to maintain a form that supports optimal hoof function and proper alignment of internal and external structures. But let me be perfectly clear. I'm not suggesting that a hoof should be trimmed into some preconceived shape, just carving it up so it looks a certain way. That's really not it. A natural trim is about applying certain rational principles to encourage the hoof to grow toward the aboriginal form. And importantly, the guiding principles to accomplish that apply to all ungulates, not just horses. In essence, an authentic natural trim mimics, substitutes for, the wear a hoof would be getting under aboriginal conditions, conditions that provide sufficient wear to offset growth and maintain a strong compact form with internal and external structures properly aligned. Now that sounds easy, right? And conceptually, it is pretty simple. But it isn't as easy to do as you might think. It requires an in-depth knowledge of the relationship among hoof components and how to recognize and achieve medial-lateral and anterior-posterior balance. And it's as important to know what not to do as it is to know what to do. A natural trim will help hooves that are pathological due to the lack of trimming or improper trimming. But it's important to understand that it's not a magic bullet. An authentic natural trim will produce strong, healthy hooves. There is no question about that. Assuming management practices and the animal's environment and welfare are reasonable. If they aren't, nothing, let me repeat that, nothing that is done to the hoof itself is going to prevent the development of hoof problems or fix them. That's why authentic natural hoof care embraces a multifaceted approach. Call it a whole animal approach. And that brings us to the other elements of natural hoof care, which are at least as important as the trim. I'll collectively call them life factors. By that, I mean all of the forces that can affect an animal's physical and mental well-being. Hoof health and shape are significantly influenced by such factors. In fact, deficiencies in life factors can undermine the efforts of even the most highly skilled trimmer. It's imperative that hoof care providers understand this basic, indisputable fact, and importantly, know that problems caused by such factors can't be prevented or fixed by trimming. They can't be fixed by putting shoes or other devices on the hoof either. It doesn't work with horses, and eventually, the zoo community will discover that it doesn't work with zoo ungulates either. Such devices and also extreme invasive procedures interfere with hoof biomechanics and function, and consequently can actually make hoof problems worse. The use of such devices indicates a lack of knowledge about barefoot hoof care and how to deal with hoof pathologies. Frankly, I cringe at some of the things I see done to the hooves of ungulates, and that are applauded as advanced treatment protocols. Instead of applying some crude, archaic device, the root cause of the problem, the life factor deficiency, has to be identified and corrected. Then, a proper trim can facilitate healing. Over nearly 20 years of interacting with leading barefoot hoof care professionals and countless horse owners around the world, I haven't heard of one case where something more was required. Not one. But I have heard of a great many horses that have been saved from euthanasia by this simple approach. Identify and correct the life factor deficiency and properly trim the hoof. Anything else is going to make the situation worse in the long run. So let's talk about factors in an animal's life that can be detrimental to hoof health. Negative life factors. They include anything and everything that jeopardizes an animal's physical and mental well-being. Physiologically, the negative impact of many life factors is mediated by the activation of the stress response. Stress puts the body into emergency mode, metabolic overdrive. The physiological processes that are triggered by stress are designed for a threatening situation, a physical threat. Efficiency, growth, and repair are put on hold to keep as many resources as possible available for dealing with the emergency. Activate the stress response too often or for too long, and an animal and its hooves are headed for trouble. At the most basic level, it's just inefficient. Every time the stress response is turned on, the animal's physiology goes into emergency mode, and it's costly. The animal loses a chunk of potential energy that could be used for normal activities and for maintaining and repairing his body, including his feet. Let me give you an example of the damage stress can do. It's a problem that isn't uncommon in captive giraffes. P3, coffin bone fractures. One study reported that 8 of the 22 giraffes in this study had P3 fractures and extensive other foot bone pathologies. Similar issues have been reported in herds of horses. But that sort of bone pathology doesn't normally occur, or maybe it never occurs, as a result of hoof overgrowth or improper trimming practices, at least not in horses. The only factor I'm aware of that can cause, or let's say initiate, that sort of devastation is stress. Stress wreaks havoc with bones and increases the risk of fractures through many different mechanisms. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the biochemical details, but if you're interested, you can use this QR code to download a list of mechanisms I put together. The short story is, stress decreases calcium availability to bones and disrupts the processes of bone formation and maintenance, biasing bone toward disintegration. Eventually, bones become porous and weak, stress-induced, or maybe it's more accurate to say, stress-aggravated osteoporosis. In humans, bones can become so brittle that just bending over coughing can cause a fracture. Supplementation with calcium or what have you won't neutralize the disintegration and weakening of bones as long as the animal remains in a stress-induced catabolic state. The United States has one of the highest calcium intakes in the world, but also one of the highest rates of osteoporosis. But that's not the end of it. If the pain caused by the bone pathology decreases movement and the weight put on the foot, then Wolff's Law jumps into the action too. Wolff's Law states that bones adapt to the demands placed on them. So when muscles are worked or weight is put on a bone, the bone remodels and becomes stronger. The opposite occurs with the lack of exercise and weight bearing. The bone atrophies. And that's what happens as a result of hoof pathologies, adding to the devastation stress causes. Now, obviously, I can't say for sure whether what I've described are actually the forces that make giraffe P3 bones susceptible to fractures. But it's not a bad bet. But bones aren't the only thing that's impacted by the stress associated with negative life factors. High levels of the stress hormone cortisol also turn the process of keratinization off, a process that is crucial for the hoof wall to grow into a strong, durable structure. Hoof wall grows down from the coronary band where hoof epidermal cells produce daughter cells called keratinocytes or keratin-producing cells, which mature and keratinize, form keratin filaments inside them. It's what makes the hoof wall hard and thick. But when the stress response is activated, the process of keratinization gets turned off. The hoof wall stops growing as it should. You see, the body is very prudent when the stress response is activated. It doesn't waste resources on long-term projects like growing hoof wall. Stress also promotes the storage of excess nutrients as fat and shifts fat storage toward visceral fat, the life-threatening fat that isn't outwardly visible but leads to all sorts of diseases and disorders like metabolic syndrome and hoof pathologies like laminitis. And that's not nearly the end of the ways the stress from suboptimal life factors can negatively affect hoof health. But there are also other important mechanisms. Diet, for example, can have a powerful effect on hoof health and the risk of hoof pathologies. But recent studies of the gut microbiome called the validity of the old formula of matching calories in and calories out into question. Energy balance clearly is much more complex than we once thought. The gut microbiome has a significant impact on nutrient extraction from food and the risk of insulin resistance, which can cause all sorts of problems, including laminitis. So, things that affect the composition of the gut microbiome are also life factors that can impact hoof health. Some life factors can even impact subsequent generations. For example, I've been suggesting for a decade that reported differences between the hooves of wild and captive foals might be due to epigenetic differences. The possibility that the terrain a mare lives and travels on can affect the development of a fetus's hooves through modifications to the epigenome is not at all inconceivable. And some effects of life factors are now known to be inherited through many subsequent generations, which should be of considerable concern to zoos with breeding programs. Here's the rub. The relationship between hoof, body, and mind are reciprocal and inseparable. Factors that affect one either directly or indirectly affect the others. That means when a life factor negatively impacts hoof health, the resulting hoof discomfort then negatively affects the animal's overall health and well-being. That, in turn, then feeds back and exacerbates the foot problem. It's a closed positive feedback loop. My diagram doesn't show it very well, but both overall and hoof health just keep getting worse, feeding off of one another. And the circle has to be broken by correcting the life factor problem. It can't be broken by trimming. And if you wait until a hoof problem is evident to take action, we've waited too long. This closed loop is already in fast-forward mode. By the time a hoof problem becomes evident, it has already and continues to have a negative impact on the animal's well-being. The truth is, a hoof pathology, or the discomfort caused by poor trimming practices, can even affect how long an animal lives. Now, maybe you're thinking, that's an exaggeration. So I'll give you an example of how it can happen. Our cells, and those of animals, are constantly wearing out and getting damaged. To maintain the health and integrity of tissues, damaged and dying cells have to be replaced as fast as they're lost. That's the job of cell division. The problem is, cells can't divide forever. There's a limit of 50 to 75 times. That limit is set by the length of telomeres. Telomeres protect the end of the chromosome from deterioration during cell replication. Telomeres play a critical role in determining the number of times a cell can divide, and therefore how long a cell line remains viable. Each time a cell divides, a portion of the telomere, the green stuff in the image, is lost. After 50 to 75 divisions, so much of the telomere has been lost that the aged cell stops dividing. Short telomeres and cellular senescence are associated with many of the diseases and disorders of aging, like those listed here, some of which, by the way, are significant risk factors for hoof pathologies. Here's the kicker.
One of the most interesting new directions of stress research is taking the effects of stress down to a nuts and bolts level of how cells work, how genes work, that half a dozen years ago nobody could have imagined.
The once unimaginable genetic structures called telomeres which protect the ends of our chromosomes from fraying. As we age, our telomeres shorten.
What's interesting is stress, by way of stress hormones, can accelerate the shortening of telomeres.
That was my old friend Rob Sapolsky. In any event, as an ever larger percentage of the body's cells are unable to replicate, maintenance and repair of the body becomes compromised. Telomere shortening is likely to account for most of the decline in efficiency and increase in vulnerability that go along with aging. And stress, say from the pain and discomfort of hoof problems, can accelerate the whole deal and shorten an animal's life. Now you might be thinking that I'm probably making a mountain out of a molehill, but in one study, telomere length in women who were chronically stressed shortened 6 times faster than normal. So, hoof pathologies should not be thought of as just a problem for the hard material at the bottom of the leg. Hoof pathologies and abnormalities can impact every aspect of an animal's well-being, and you can only fix the problem by proper trimming if it was caused by improper trimming practices. But if it was caused by a problem in life factors, then nothing that is done to the hoof itself is going to fix it. So when you look at hoof care from a holistic point of view and understand that the relationships of hoof, body, and mind are reciprocal and inseparable, it becomes obvious that hoof care should be an ongoing part of preventative care. It should be proactive, not reactive. In my opinion, zoos should have at least one full-time dedicated hoof care professional on staff. I also want to mention that life factors can have positive effects as well as negative effects. An enriched environment has many physical and mental benefits. It can even counteract the destructive effects of stress. So to me, the efforts of the zoo community to provide animals with an environment and lifestyle that's rich in social interactions and sensory diversity, and that provide opportunities for natural movement, are really admirable and undoubtedly have a positive effect on hoof health. The good news is training, done properly, is also a powerful way to enrich a captive animal's life, and it's an important part of proper hoof care. Animals should be trained for voluntary hoof care. It makes trimming far safer for the animal, and it provides cognitive stimulation, mental challenges that are otherwise absent from their lives. Training fills a bit of the void left by the lack of control that's inherent to life in captivity. That means hoof care provides another path to enriching an animal's life and improving its overall well-being. So I hope I've convinced you that there is a great deal more to proper hoof care than just hacking off some tissue to make a hoof look a certain way or applying some archaic artificial device. I promise you, that's a path with a cliff at the end. Acquiring the skill and knowledge to be a true hoof care professional for barefoot animals requires a rounded education under the guidance of experienced instructors. And it takes time to move through all the phases of skill and knowledge acquisition to arrive at a point where you truly can be called a professional, an expert, someone who is qualified to trim live animals and who can discuss an animal's hoof health with veterinarians, keepers, dietitians, and so on. It's something a hoof care professional should be able to do because they might be the first person to recognize that something is wrong in an animal's life. You see, the hoof is a very handy diagnostic tool. It provides a window into an animal's well-being, assuming you are sufficiently knowledgeable to look through that window, and that you are also sufficiently familiar with an animal's hooves to recognize deviations from what's normal for that animal. another reason to have a dedicated hoof care provider on staff. The zoo community makes a stellar effort to provide their animals with the best possible care, with a natural environment that enriches their lives and encourages them toward natural movement and behavior. A hoof care provider should be compatible with these efforts. They should understand what is and what is not natural for the hooves of ungulates. And of course, they should be trained and certified through a reputable barefoot hoof care program. Not someone who's been trained to shape metal and apply shoes with minimal, if any, education about the principles of barefoot hoof care and the natural forces that impact hoof health. So now I'm going to turn this over to Cindy, who is going to tell you about how the multifaceted approach we advocate greatly improved hooves at Naples Zoo. Cindy is the Animal Operations Manager at Naples Zoo. She's a certified zoo hoof care professional and an instructor in our training program.
Hello, I'm Cindy Hall, Animal Operations Manager at Naples Zoo. Being in the zoological animal care field for nearly 30 years, pursuit of professional hoof care of my own horses led me to the educational resource of Liberated Horsemanship. It was there that my zoo ungulate and equine worlds crossed paths. For decades, I had always felt that there was more to the conditions that seemed to plague ungulates in human care. When posing the why question to the traditional farriers called in to tend to our animals, the answers were always the same. Aggressively trim the foot under an often stressful sedation event, treating or band-aiding the current symptom rather than addressing the cause or origin of the condition. It was always a reactive rather than proactive approach. Fortunately, I never gave up on my search to answer the why and was able to gain that knowledge to include what Dr. Nock has briefly discussed here, to start the process of answering that question, then applying it to the management of these magnificent animals. I would like to share just one story of many from my zoo hoof care world that shows how a multifaceted, proactive rather than reactive approach to hoof care has made a big difference. For most of my 30-year zoo career, we've been chasing pathologies and treating the same symptoms over and over again, with the same end results, rather than looking at the causes of the conditions and making changes to prevent the recurrences. For me, one of the most important examples is a Damara or Burchell zebra named Oasis. She was born in Naples about 20 years ago. Yes, I was actually there then, and I still am. Life for this zebra in human care has been an uphill battle. Yes, with this particular zebra, we were initially reacting to her current hoof concerns, but by collecting information, identifying the life factors that were not ideal for this species, and applying my liberated horsemanship knowledge to make adjustments to how the species was managed, we were creating a proactive rather than reactive approach. We were creating a zoo lifestyle that better aligned with the Aboriginal or natural lifestyle. First, let's consider what life factors were impacting her hoof health. Here are some of the life factors of Oasis the zebra. Her diet. Did her diet replicate the nutrition of a wild zebra? Resource presentation. Were resources, food and water, being presented in a natural way? The substrate of her habitat. Was the ground cover similar to the habitat of a wild zebra? And the habitat design or the layout. Does the habitat allow for natural movement patterns of this species? And then natural hoof growth and wear. How is that being accomplished? Considering which of these factors were ideal or not ideal for this species based on Aboriginal lifestyle and habitat, there was honestly a recipe for hoof health disaster. This was the result. There's nothing natural about these feet as compared to wild zebra hooves. You can see hoof wall separation, thin, brittle hoof walls, compacted sole, overgrown toes, underrun heels, and she had frequent periods of mild to moderate lameness. Considering her diet, historically, the diet was sweet feed and alfalfa hay. Zebra are a primitive equid. They have very efficient digestive systems and can live well off of old-growth forage. Part of the reason other ungulates will travel with zebra is because they'll eat the old-growth plants, revealing the newer, higher nutritional value forage that other species need. So molasses, corn, cereal grains, it's just too much sugar and starch for this species. Then a legume hay versus a grass hay, again, was too much and not natural nutrition for this species. This diet was a life factor that was not favorable for hoof or body health. What does the species of zebra eat in the wild? How closely are we replicating that diet? So the current diet is now coastal Bermuda grass hay with a daily ration of a no iron mineral balancer. This is to address the high iron content of the forage and well water. The grass hay better suited the nutritional needs of a primitive equid, but we did have the high iron content common to Florida-grown forages to consider. Iron, copper, and zinc imbalance is a concern. We have a nutritional analysis test on each shipment of hay. Based on that analysis, supplementation of additional copper and zinc can support a more ideal ratio. Why is it important to balance the iron overload? Well, because high iron contributes to absorption problems of copper and zinc, which are essential to the health of connective tissues, such as hair, skin, keratin, hooves. Resource presentation. Zebras eating in a shelter versus these hay bags you can see in the picture, for example. Multiple locations for hay at or near ground level. Why? Well, social stress for resources can be an undesirable life factor. Having choices for those resources reduces that stress. Ground level? Well, equids can't salivate with their heads elevated, so ground level is a naturally more favorable feeding posture. Hay presented in containers like these small whole hay bags can allow for a more natural, gradual, small bite consumption of those resources. Additionally, spreading around the habitat to facilitate movement while consuming resources will also support gut health by preventing acid buildup and possibly ulcers common to equids in human care that are given limited space for movement and spend long periods of time without forage. Equids should not go more than 4 hours without forage resources to prevent the buildup of strong acids in the digestive system. About 80% of domestic equids in human care have ulcers. Why wouldn't the same apply to wild equids in human care? Enrichment additions. Why is that important? We've briefly heard about the impact on hoof health that the stress response can have from Bruce's presentation. An enriched environment will decrease the stress response and increase hoof health. The habitat layout was addressed. Habitat grading from steep inclines with large, sharp shell rock to flat terraces with smaller, rounded gravel and additional soft dirt areas for resting. Why? Well, that was a question I had to answer to convince my director that this expensive renovation was necessary. Recalling the information that Bruce spoke of regarding the physiological changes to the hoof when an animal experiences unfavorable life factors. This would further support the healing process by providing additional physical comfort. And then, when they are ready, convince your director to allow you to cut holes in the perimeter fence of the habitat that happens to also be the front of the habitat where guests will be standing most often. But wait, it was actually a bonus benefit, creating additional opportunities for guest engagement that allows for education about voluntary participation in their own healthcare through training. Animals become less reactive to irregular variables since it's not a controlled environment. And what does that do? Reduces the stress response, which, as you may have heard by now, improves hoof health. Now notice that the actual trimming is the life factor that I've placed last. That's because we cannot trim healthy hoof quality into a hoof. Trimming is meant to only remove the parts that a natural lifestyle and aboriginal habitat would. Even the most skilled hoof care professional cannot trim a foot to have healthy hoof quality. A trim won't make a thin, brittle hoof wall suddenly strong. It won't support proper mineral balance necessary for the development of connective tissues and keratin. It won't reduce the stress response to multiple variables the way an enriched environment will. And it's not going to support natural feeding behaviors. So keep in mind that hooves in the wild grow and wear simultaneously. They don't overgrow, then suddenly wear down or break off. Then why wouldn't we manage hooves in human care more frequently if our goal is to replicate life outside the wild as closely as possible to life in the wild? So short, frequent trim sessions with a certified zoo hoof care professional more closely replicates natural growth and wear. It is also a more attainable goal given the tight schedule that zoo professionals have and more likely to be repeated by both human and animal. My team's more likely to be able to fit in a 10-minute trim session or training session for 4 animals in our busy short-staffed days than a 30-minute session. So support the healing process with voluntary participation of frequent balanced trimming with a certified zoo hoof care professional. And now to show you the impact of those efforts. This is an image of the front left foot of Oasis the zebra, the first one being in October of 2022 and the second one July of 2023. So that's a 9-month interval in between the images. Look at the comparisons of the hoof wall to the coffin bone angles. Notice how much the coffin bone is pulled away from the hoof wall on the first one versus the second one. Now keep in mind the healing process takes time. The problems didn't occur overnight. This was the result of years of undesirable life factors. So 9 months isn't actually that much time at all. A new hoof takes 10 to 12 months to grow out. Again, on her front right foot images, the separation of the hoof wall is even visible on the first image. There's evidence on these images of demineralization or bone loss at the tip of the coffin bone. Today, however, there is barely a trace at ground level of that separation. So for now, the life factors and the foot are more balanced. Then versus now. Now the bone loss may or may not be resolved. Remember Wolff's Law, as Bruce mentioned? But what we can do is keep the feet balanced while addressing any possible life factors. When gaining that first set of images, I was a bit distraught, knowing how she must be physically experiencing life as an animal that needs to be mobile to survive. What was I missing? Have I failed this animal despite all my efforts, all thoughts that I had? There were stages of improvement to the way the hoof was growing along the way. The lameness would come and go. She would move around the habitat more often. The previously unhealthy growth would reach ground level and look worse. That would grow out and look better. So actually, no, I had not failed this animal. I just needed to be patient and realize that taking all of these life factors into consideration was making a difference in the long term. It's a marathon, not a sprint race. This is the result of a holistic approach to the animal's well-being, an approach that caught my attention at my first Liberated Horsemanship Hoof Care Clinic that I knew would be a benefit to zoo animal management. So please, don't give up. I'm so glad that we didn't with her. Keep digging for information, collecting data, looking for answers, and getting to the roots of the conditions. These changes will support her comfort and prevent further damage for the rest of her life while supporting healthy hooves for the current and future herds. Your animals will thank you. Now, I have seen a similar story repeated for several species. The same life factors that impacted Oasis the zebra's reciprocal hoof, mind, and body health carries across all ungulate species. Addressing the causes and supporting the feet as they grew healthy hoof with educated, experienced trimming was the holistic approach that led to the after images you can see here. A proactive rather than reactive approach. The time is now. we can make a difference. I hope that we will all begin to consider the variables that impact the reciprocal relationship of our zoo ungulates' hoof, mind, and body health, and prioritize the addition of a certified zoo hoof care professional at every zoo through resources like this.